right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome back to the Tinder Bundle, where believers come together to kindle their flame of faith. And here we look at or discuss life hacks, practical techniques for living in today's world. And I'm your host, the Wandering Avad, and today we're going to do something a little bit different. This is going to be a little more free flowing. I just wanted to talk a little bit, and I will shortly also be posting a little video that can accompany this little podcast here that you'll find on YouTube. But today I wanted to talk about my experience with Self Reliant September. And I'm getting that morning cup of coffee and getting ready. But yes, so I wanted to talk about what my experience was like and some of the things I learned and some of the things that where I failed, where I succeeded, and just the journey that maybe I can also keep a little log so next year when I join and I can come back and see where I need to improve and what more I got to work on. And this may work for anybody else who joined out in Self Reliant September. But before anything, let's have a brief word. Great and Heavenly Father, thank you for life. Thank you for purpose. And thank you for the plan. In your name, amen. So, I'd like to begin, and I always begin with a little bit of scripture. And I'm going to begin with Proverbs 6. We're going to be reading from 6 through 11. And this is a template that helped initiate why I started doing Self-Reliant September. And it reads, "Go to the ant, you sluggard. Consider its ways, and be wise. It has no commander, no overseer or ruler, yet it stores up its provisions in the summer and gathers its food at the harvest. How long will you lie there, O sluggard? When will you get up from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come on to you like a thief, and scarcity like an armed man." Now, when I look at a scripture like this, I see it speaking of why we must be preparing, why we must always get ready, why we must be looking towards the future while you're living the best life you can in the present. You see, a lot of times we're focusing on the plans for the future, but if you're not actively living out what needs to be done today, when the future steps in, you're lagging behind. You know, I seen a simple case of this, yes, outside of food. When I used to go to school, before I began to implement some serious strategies for being a better student, I remember I used to see something. I know the project's going to be easy, so I would wait. And I'd have fun during the days. I'd do whatever I want. And then all of a sudden, the professor, the teacher, or instructor would remind us, oh, due date's coming up, and boom. All of a sudden, now I'm scrambling, trying to get all the information I can to finish up these papers or to build a project. And sometimes you don't get a chance because you find out when you procrastinate and went in so late, all those materials and resources have already been done. Like, for example, in our class, sometimes we were going for this mat borm that we had to frame our artwork with. And sometimes if you waited to last minute, it's all the good ones are gone up and you're just getting these scrap little pieces. And so I realized something like this talks about every day, do something that is going to prepare you to succeed for your tomorrow. So throughout the month of September, I learned a lot of things regarding preparation and what it takes to actually get through 1 month of some form of self-reliance. And I feel privileged that I would be able to share this because maybe it might help somebody else. Now, excuse me if by chance in certain places I become redundant. I'm not really moving off of a script or anything like that. I'm just going to pour out my experiences. Yeah, I do got a few points just jotted down, but that's about it. So the first thing I want to talk about is, where did this idea come from for Self-Reliant September? And it began for me in 2020, where when I recognized what was going on through the pandemic that was hitting the place. Now, I had been practicing preparedness techniques for quite some time. I was practicing little gardening things here and there, but I never brought it to the serious extreme of, how could I, for instance, take care of myself with food. Now, what got me into preparedness, funny enough, was backpacking. I love backpacking. When I was younger, I used to be part of a youth group called Pathfinders. They taught us all these great skills and stuff, how to take care of ourselves in the wild, as well as inside your home. And you would learn practical techniques as for home care, stuff like sewing, cooking, hygiene, proper water, careful water, knot tying, all sorts of stuff. But then there was stuff that also dealt with outside, and I always loved the outdoors. Now, I'm an asthmatic, and I tend to find whenever I'm outdoors, I gain more clarity. I breathe better. Everything just comes more to life. And so I tend to find every day I have to find a way to get outside. I don't know what it is in me, but there's just always an urge to be outside. So bringing this back, what ended up happening, I recognized throughout that season, was, first off, I was watching the world around me go crazy. Nobody was prepared for, if anything were to happen, how they were going to survive that season. In addition to that, I watched how the grocery stores all of a sudden were just losing. The shelves were going empty like crazy. And this is early in the pandemic. And I was sitting there saying, what would happen if the whole supply chain shuts down? What would happen if everything just stopped? How well would majority people survive? Because I realize there are some people, for example, who don't even really collect groceries. Very minuscule, because they're used to eating out. So there's always somebody else preparing food for them. And then in some cases, even if they do have the food, they don't know what to do with it. And they don't know how to keep it long. So sometimes food always goes bad inside the freezer. Not the freezer, the fridge, whatever it may be. And so the idea of Self-Reliant September came about by looking at if the on demand that supply chain went down and there was no food, the grocery stores had to lock up. How would I survive? And by extension, for me, this was something big because I do have a family. And as the leader of my home, as the chief and priest of this house, I believe I have to be able to take care of my family when push comes to shove. You're always doing it, but make sure that you have the education and the qualifications to make sure that if we need to go, I've got everything we need, and we've drilled, we've practiced to get ready and go. And if we need to hunker down and stay indoors, I've put in place everything that needs to be put in place that we can survive staying indoors. So I began to look at food. And I asked myself the question, if everything shut down, can I feed myself for 1 month? Which then led to the next question. Well, if I was going to feed myself for 1 month, where would my food come from? Now, I was taking this from a perspective, not from going into our food stores, our storage, like the things we have locked up in, whether it's in our pantry or within our food storage barrels or whatnot. No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking, what if all the food was depleted and I was left with the land, my skills, and maybe a couple of seeds? What could I do? So, Self-Reliant September was born. And during 2020, I began to educate myself and build up to try and get through the month of September, living off of the food that I had either grown, foraged. I've harvested from my own garden. I hunted, I fished, or I trapped. And in regards to certain things, I gave myself an allowance of food that I processed for myself. For example, making my own oil or any little things like that. Now, mind you, I did give myself an allowance. And my allowance was I was allowed 3 items. 3 items. Now, those 3 items, one, it could not be meat. Two, it could not be vegetables. So, when I say vegetables, that yes, vegetables also deals with the carbs and stuff. So therefore, I would give myself, for instance, permission of oil. I gave myself permission of seasons, such as salt. I was very minimal when it came to the seasoning and stuff. And I did have an extra one, which was a protein powder, which I tried not to really tap into much at all, but I did give myself that allowance. I gave myself those allowances because I did realize there are certain things that many of us would not naturally be able to develop on our own. For example, I still am trying to figure out how do I make my own salt. But anyways, as we move on. So then, as I began to get into this, what I realized was it's all about location. So this September, I was sitting there saying, okay, location. I got a backyard I could utilize. Now, I thought to myself, okay, so for me, well, the first thing is I got to figure out how am I going to garden? What am I going to plant and where am I going to plant it? And how much can I plant in a certain space that I can actually sustain from? One of the things that helped me in understanding where I would do this experience is I picked up a book, or I shouldn't say I picked up a book. We got a hold of a book and then we actually purchased it for ourselves called All You Can Eat in 3x3. I forget who the author's name is. Whenever I find the author's name, I'll post it inside of the description below. And no, I'm not getting any kind of sponsorship or anything for mentioning their name. The fact is, it's a very good book. And if you can get it, it shows you how much you can actually harvest or garden within a very small space. And it is very creative. So we utilized that kind of information to try and figure out within the small spaces we had to garden, how much could we do and what kind of things could we garden or plant that would actually benefit the most of us. One of the things, I also had these bags, I guess growing bags. So one of the greatest things that I was able to do was grow potatoes. They were the lifesaver. But I found out that when doing this and when I was helping some other people who were interested in this idea, the idea is we had to figure out where can we do this kind of experience? Where can others do it? I knew some people who didn't have a balcony. They didn't have a backyard or a communal garden. So it became, okay, they had their own modified version of Self Reliant September, but they would work through one pot or building up a little bed within their home. So I realized you have to figure out where you're going to do this to make sure it will suffice with everything. Now, for me, I utilized the space that I had to plant food. But then what I also began to do is geocache all over the place. And I guess I was using it in a different way than it should be used because I was looking for where are the wild edibles? Where do I find fish? Where do I find things that I can use when my garden runs out? And when I would encounter these places, I'd make sure I got them noted down. So if worst case scenario, I could always go there and collect some food. Now, other than figuring out where I would do this, of course, as I had mentioned earlier, I then had to ask myself the question of what would I practice self-reliance at? Now, everybody can practice with many different things. For example, some people might say, you know what, I'm going to try, instead of using tap water, what happens if electricity went down and I couldn't have water? Could I self-sustain myself for 1 month with collecting my own water? Now, this deals with you having methods of purifying your water. Not only that, going out and collecting water, whether it's finding springs or going to the lake or when it rains, having a rain catch. Some other people might do energy in modified forms, for example, living off of strictly solar energy as long as they could, or living without turning on their lights and living off of candles, like whatever it may be. For some people, their self reliance might have been, what happens if the grid goes down and I couldn't use my technology? How would I make it through without tapping into my phone all the time? Or when I'm driving on the road, not being able to tap into my GPS, actually breaking out a paper map. And so I chose food because it was something that I thought my whole entire family could benefit from greatly. Now, I was the only one who did it. They did help me prepare, though, and that was a blessing. And being able to see how much it took to feed me helped me better understand exactly how much it would take to feed my whole family. Now, this led me then, after I chose what I was going to be self-reliant on, I moved into education and learning a deeper understanding about preparedness when it comes to food. I was learning about when to do what, like when to start actually germinating these seeds, and knowing the perfect time to move my seeds, whether it's I germinated them on a wet towel and then plant them into peat moss, or even just growing them straight from the peat moss, and then learning when is the wisest time to bring them from indoors to outdoors. You see, I made some mistakes with that. For example, I remember bringing certain things out because the weather looked so great, even though the almanac had said, no, the last frost is going to be closer to late May, but the weather was just so unpredictable. It was looking so great. Planted some stuff out there, and of course, last frost hit us. What ended up happening? I lost quite a bit of the crop. So, learning about your timing, when to do what. I also was seeking around people who could help me better understand where to plant what, because I began to learn as you're understanding plants and stuff, not everything can live together. Some things help and have a symbiotic relationship in the soil, and some things steal and destroy the other plants, which we'll talk about shortly. But I made sure I got help, and I got guidance from people who can help me get through this. Now, I also had to know my food. I had to know what I can actually consume over a long time and when the harvest would actually be ripe. So I had to make sure everything is mapped out in such a way so that when September starts, there is food to begin to eat. And then throughout September, I can continue to harvest from these things. But in some cases, harvesting would happen before that. So I had to make sure I could also harvest this food and find a way to preserve it for September. Also recognize you got to know your soil. You have to learn about pumping in the right nutrition into your soil, watering it, how to water it at the right times. Excuse me. And then knowing how to churn it, knowing how to preserve it with proper mulch, making sure you got the right types of soils going on. And so all of these things in producing were things that I wasn't ever really paying attention to, so I had to. And so, yeah, we already talked about nutrients, putting nutrients into the soil, making sure you've got everything those plants are going to need. And then the watering, you see, when it came to watering, I didn't even realize there's a reason why they have certain times you water during the day for the most effective growth, because sometimes in the middle of the hot, hot sun, if you choose to bring out the hose and spray down your plants, what you don't realize sometimes is as you're spraying down the plants, the water droplets that land on top of the leaves, if the sun is hot enough, they act like a magnifying glass, and now start burning holes, burning up your leaves. Not to mention if too hot and the roots haven't dug deep enough into the cooler parts of the soil, you can also cook some of the roots, which will stunt the growth of the plant. And so you want to make sure that you're watering or have a nice irrigation system that can get water to the plants in the safest manner possible. Also, when it was coming to timing, I also learned about when is the best time to fish. I learned that for every type of fish, they have different times they want to come out to eat. Not in addition to that, I learned there's different times in the day that is the best time to go for certain types of fish. And so you begin to learn also within each body of water, it's different how each fish behaves. And so I had to start wrapping my head around learning stuff like about fishing. Now, I was never really a big fisher. I liked it, but I wasn't good. I have improved greatly as I'm slowly learning, and I'm still learning a lot of skills in regards to fishing, but even learning the proper way to set up your line to get the best fishing in different circumstances, learning when to use a bobbin and when not to, when to use the adjustable float, or when to drag. I shouldn't say drag, when to, what do they call it? Troll to catch your fish, or even when to set a trap and to get the best out of that. So you have a, in a sense, of passive way of fishing, or even when to use that weight, when not to. Like, there are so many things I slowly began to learn. I remember at one place where I was going, I'm fishing. I can even see the fish, but I'm not getting nothing. And then the man came in and began to explain to me, you need to take this off, need to put this on, put this type of hook. So you even begin to learn what kind of hooks will catch what kind of fish, and what hooks are the best and easiest to pull out, like the barbless ones, versus is it barbed using the tri hook? I don't know what they properly call it. I may not be using the right names, but yeah, I'm sure you get the idea of what I'm saying. Even when it came to forage, oh my goodness, the amount of education that went into learning what you can eat and what you can't eat, and making sure you can identify it properly. Because if you can't identify it properly, you can get sick by eating some of the wrong types of foods out there. So I learned a lot about foraging. I learned how to identify certain edible mushrooms, which I was happy about because they were a lifesaver and a great change. And I remember even when I encountered the wild grapes, being able to go home, and instead of just having water, I had me some grape juice, which was awesome. Another beautiful thing was when we grew the cucumbers. Oh my goodness, those were lifesavers. Putting that cucumbers in my water just gave me that reminder of a flavored drink and stuff. And I began to learn a lot about hunting. I did not get to do any hunting because there's certain things I still not have been able to get, but I did get my tools and stuff. And I'm hoping next year for Self-Reliant that during the spring there will be some hunting, and so a lot of difference. It should be a lot different for next year. And I had to ask myself moving forward the simple question of, what do I eat? And in knowing what you eat, it helps you to come up with a plan of, what will I plant? What will I fish? What am I going to look to hunt for? All these ideas really begin to able to be better laid out. You get the pen and paper, you lay out what do you eat, and now you can go to the garden and say, okay, this is where I'm going to plant X, Y, and Z, and yada, yada, yada. And next thing you know, you've already got your visions laid out on paper. Always put it to paper. And that way you could see, okay, this is what I got to do, and it'll take from this time to this time to get this. And I need to start collecting fish from over here, so I got to start studying, learning this skill here. Got to go out and practice. So figuring out what I ate made all the difference with how good I would come up with the plan. Now, going back to timing, something I also want to touch with. You begin to recognize, now it's in September where autumn really steps in, but how much can you harvest? What can you do in that winter time as you're preparing? In the springtime? What can you do in the summer, and what can you do in the autumn? And learning how to utilize each season to maximize the best benefit. And going back to something I've already said before, one of the biggest things that need to be mastered is knowing the best times to sow, so you can maximize the best times to harvest. Because if you sow your garden properly, you can have a spring harvest, you can have a summer harvest, and you can also get an autumn harvest. Now, I recently have been showed this skill that I'm going to try out this winter, where you can actually have a winter harvest, growing certain things like cruciferous vegetables or even carrots and stuff. And you're just going to build up a winterized box, but it will be outside in the garden because I recently learned that the soil, after a certain depth, if it is not in constant contact with the snow and all that, it stays warm enough to still grow the hardier vegetable plants. So I am going to test that out for this winter and see how that works. But the idea there is understanding when you can do what. Remember what that proverb said? Oh, slugger, look at the ant. How he knows when to collect, so he's getting ready for the harvest. Now, when I started practicing and getting out there and doing all this kind of stuff, I was so excited, like in the beginning, I remember the first week of September, I was logging everything. And I had videos and stuff like that. I'm going to share those things on YouTube as well. But then it became such hard work, the videos really started slowing down. All these things started slowing down because so much energy was going into being successful that I didn't really have that time to keep videoing everything I was doing to try and survive this September. And one of the things I wish I was videoing is a lot of my miscalculations. How I lost food due to weather. I remember even in one situation, we had a serious rainstorm that came in. It got where I live is a little bit more north, way out north, but I'm out of the city and it was a lot colder. This heavy rain that rained at least 3 or 4 days straight ended out beaten down on the garden so hard, it tore apart all the leaves. It destroyed so many plants, and then it is like this slow return of hoping these plants would come back. And some of them never really officially came back. I think I'm going to have to wait till next year. I did have some stuff in some pots, like some peppers and all that, and I'm hoping that I can winterize them, and let's see if they'll be able to work out for next year. But the weather was a huge thing, and not knowing how to properly cover or protect the vegetables and stuff from the weather. The other thing I learned, one of the biggest miscalculations I had was I read everywhere there is proper places to put certain plants. Did I listen? No. In some cases, I was experimenting. Like, for example, I knew it's good to have pollinators within every pot, so every pot of mine had strawberries. Funny enough, I never really got to eat any of the strawberries. I think I got one. Why? Because these damn chipmunks kept coming in and eating our fruits every time they bore. So we learned what we're going to do for next year is wherever the strawberry patch is, there's going to be a mesh. But one of the things I learned, for example, was how evil tomatoes are. Now, I did not really learn how to prune tomatoes properly, which I learned can become a very big problem. I didn't realize tomatoes are almost invasive. They're like weeds. They grow and grow and grow. And in some cases, some branches of the tomatoes would fall off or get broken. And they'd land on the ground. I didn't tend to it immediately. Next thing I realized, these branches are rooting into the ground. So now, even outside of the garden bed, I've got these tomatoes growing all over the place. It was chaos. These tomatoes came and took over everything. Tomatoes are bullies if you don't keep them in check. I was stupid enough that because I didn't pay attention to the rules, I almost had tomato plants in almost all of my gardens. Well, I also planted peppers with them. I planted kale with them. And these tomatoes would shoot and overgrow so much they overpowered so many of the other vegetables that in a lot of cases I did not get to reap what I should have reaped because of those bullies. It almost became like tomatoes versus everything. So I learned the hard way that next year when I do grow tomatoes, yeah, all my tomatoes will be in one section and one section alone. And I also learned I'm not going to grow many tomatoes. I don't need to grow many tomatoes. The amount of tomato sauce we have here in other form of canned tomatoes is ridiculous. Also, I recognize when you're not caring and doing it properly, your tomatoes, if they're with the wrong plants and all, they'll get diseased. I don't know what some of these diseases were, but there were some weird things that I seen. Sometimes it would be these yellow circly spots that pop up all over the tomatoes. Sometimes it's all over the plant stems itself that are changing color. And so I learned, stick to the program and what those professionals say on how to grow tomatoes. Another miscalculation I made was going my own route with food storage. I lost batches of food that I had canned because I had to learn the hard way about canning in oil. I realize when you buy certain things in the store that are canned in oil, they have certain processes that made sure they sealed perfectly, that if you don't have these tools, you can't do it at home. I realized canning in oil is a very, very difficult thing. And why was I canning in oil? Because I wanted to make sure the fat content was high in the food I was eating, since I wouldn't really be eating any carbs. So I had to make sure that my energy levels were coming from somewhere. Yeah, I would be eating potatoes, but on certain days when I'm not eating potatoes, I just wanted to make sure I was getting enough energy to go through my days. So I learned so bad. I remember it was about the second week into September. I was getting tired of the food I was eating already, and so I went to open up one of the cans, and when we opened it, it smelled. It stunk in a certain way, and I'm like, this thing didn't seal properly. And then I remember my mother even tried it. She looked like she wanted to vomit. The thing tastes so bad, it just spoiled. And I realized after doing my research, when canning in oil, one of the biggest problems is because of the fat, the oil does not allow the seal to connect the way you want it to. And because of that, it ends out allowing air to get in there where it shouldn't be and all these things. And so, of course, the microbiomes, everything goes to work. And next thing you know, this thing begins to just go bad. And so, because I was trying to can greens. So I was trying to can certain kale. We had different types of kales we were growing, like blue kale and curly kale. Other leafy greens like Swiss chard and stuff like that. And so I was trying a technique to just can them and see if that could work. Yeah, didn't work. Lost so much, which was very discouraging because now a lot of the food that was supposed to help sustain me is gone. So these are some of the things that I actually learned in regards about paying attention to people's calculation who have been doing it for a long time. But moving from that, the beautiful thing about canning, it taught me, and there was other techniques of other ways for food storage and food preservation, ways to keep my food longer because you have oh so much fridge space. So besides canning in oil, I also learned a fair bit about pickling. Canning in water, and that worked perfectly fine. I still have some now that I'm just periodically picking into. I've learned I probably won't ever do the oil anymore. But in regards to pickling, very effective. And I realized the major technique is just salt and water or vinegar. And then from there, whatever spices you want to do in. But I learned through my failures what things to stay away from, what not to be trying to pickle and stuff, and what to be. Or maybe I just haven't learned the proper skills to do certain foods. I did try in certain times of salt curing, dry salt curing, and it didn't work the way I guess I didn't keep the environment controlled enough because I remember I was doing this outside. I even had a net over the fish that I was curing. And the thing is, as you put the salt in, you'll recognize it keeps drying out the water. So you got to get the water out and keep going, keep going, keep going. And so I left it for a certain amount of time, came back in, flies were covering all over my fish. And I realized, yeah, I got to figure this one out. But this has also caused me that now I'm trying to learn about what are effective ways to learn how to smoke fish. And next year I also probably want to be smoking meat. So I'm hoping to learn these skills between now and next September that I can be able to do this. Another way I was storing stuff, which is a technique I've been using from ever since I started backpacking, is dehydrating. I would dehydrate tons of the vegetables, and then whether it's turn them into a powder, turn them into a nice seasoning, or just leave them whole, put in one of those silicone gels in the Mylar bag, tie them up, or put them in jars, just keep them away. And that is how I would run. Because I tend to find, for instance, still to this day, when I go backpacking, like Mr. Noodles is a go-to for me. Excuse me, when I go backpacking, and what I would do is cook it up, and then I get my vegetables or whatever and just throw them in there and just beef up these soups and stuff, which during Self-Reliant September, soup was a gift from God. Getting all these vegetables into the thing, you're getting all this hydration, but you're getting all these minerals and stuff. It was a lifesaver when food was at those low points. So yes, and then of course, there was freezing. A lot of freezing of my fish that I caught. And yeah, that was the primary ways that I was learning how to preserve my food and trying not to put it all and clog up the fridge with the food. Another way that I was actually preserving, I guess this isn't even really preserving, but knowing when to pick how much I need to pick so I'm eating at the right time. Like I would go into my potato bags rather than digging them all up. I go and dig out what I need. And then I would eat my potatoes. This leads me into something else, which is realizing how much work is needed. Oh my goodness. I became a busy person going through September. Like, first off, finding the right seeds. And I began to learn a lot more about GMO, non-organic, or even heirlooms. I realized in a lot of cases, the vegetables that are grown in the grocery mart, yeah, they might taste good or all right. The seeds they produce are not seeds that will really produce back the food you even just ate. You might get a fruit, but it's going to be even blander. It's as if there's something has been modified within these fruits to not let them be able to reproduce the way they want to. I learned this by doing a distance in certain seed testing. I've taken the normal food out there, planting those, taking what they claimed was organic seeds, planting those, and then also planting what they call heirloom seeds. I found, me personally, the heirloom, non-GMO, organic seeds were the best flavoring food we planted. And so learning to get the right types of seeds and germinating, oh my goodness, it can take a lot. Or you even planting all this stuff, and a lot of times things don't come, so you got to go back again, making sure you got the right lighting or they're in the right location so they can come up the best. And even learning about when to do this watering. A lot of times, some of this doesn't work with my schedule. So I'd have to be plugging into this. I work an evening night shift, so it kind of messes how even when I was actually doing the watering, like sometimes it would be, I'm coming home from work about 3 in the morning, and then I'm coming in, and that's when I'm going to water the plants. Like everything was counter the way I would have really wanted it, but I also had a lot of help. And so that helped me during the days when I wasn't here or sleeping and stuff. Somebody would care for it. But it's amazing how much work goes into planting, tilling the ground, planting the seeds in the proper spot, even harvesting, getting out there, collecting the right ones, learning when it's ready and when it's not ready. Or fishing. Oh my goodness. I love fishing now. Now I love it. But sometimes when you're out there for hours and nothing's happening, how much time goes into trying to get just one meal? And foraging. There's a lot of walking and foraging. And a lot of work. In one case, I found some Canadian wild rye. I was ecstatic. I went and I was like, I'm going to harvest this. I'm going to make my own bread. I didn't know how much work goes into you learning how to thrash your rye, learning how to pick it properly. I think they call it winnowing, getting the husk off of it so that you can actually get that grain. And I didn't do it properly, so when I grind it up to make my flour, I'm thinking maybe it's just a little extra fiber. I understand why you got to get that whole husk off, because if you don't, that fiber is inedible, simply just inedible. Uh, you can't even chew and break it down. That's how bad it gets. Because I remember we grind it up. I took some oil and water and salt. That's how simple my bread was. Made a little patty, put it down there, cook. I like did it in stovetop, almost the same way you do the roti or naan or like pita, any of those flat kind of breads. And when I went to chew, I'm chewing, I'm chewing, I'm chewing, and I couldn't stop chewing. I couldn't break through all the husk. The trash should have been taken. So I learned a valuable lesson. That bread kind of went to garbage because as I chewed, I realized all I was getting was salty oil. But I couldn't get no nutrients from the actual grain, or I didn't feel like I would. Not to mention, so I put the bread down. Within less than 2 days, fungus and mold was all over it. It just went bad. And so I realized it's a lot of work, especially in processing. I even remember I began to learn how to make oil, and I was learning how to process, and I was making avocado oil because I had the avocado. And then from taking that avocado oil, I would, mash it out, put it in the pan, keep mixing it, keep going, breaking it down, and then you heat it up. And after you heat it up, next thing you know, you put it into the cheesecloth and start squeezing out the oil. I got this oil and all this stuff. It's a lot of work and takes a lot of time. I now realize how much work these people are doing in the grocery chains, the food lane chain, that you need to get this food to eat. So it was pretty crazy. So I realize it takes a lot. Now, that being said, okay, because it takes a lot, I learned something that I will never let go. I learned about the need for community. Now, community for me is something I learned a lot about. Learning that being self-reliant really isn't just about yourself, but it's about networking and knowing who and what you need to successfully be self-reliant. Yes, it sounds counterintuitive to the term because we're seeing this word self and we begin to think, well, this is me taking care of myself. But we were created as communal creatures and we all come with different skills, knowledge sets, and other things that help one another achieve the goals we're trying to get. So I learned that getting help is actually not a bad thing. It's something that is very good for us if we're willing to contribute towards each other's vision, walking on the same path. Now, here's an example. I had said to myself that if I was invited out, I would eat whatever somebody would put before me or allow me to eat. And I said this under the lines of I didn't go to the grocery store. And plus, even if I was out in the bush, if I had encountered some other people camping and they were like, hey, would you like to share this? I would gladly take it if it's something that I deem kosher. And so I recognized, okay, I got invited to go out to a little barbecue. I learned a valuable lesson though on that barbecue because while I was eating and because of my moderation and limiting how much I eat, my stomach had shrunk. And so when I went to the barbecue, I ate and I ate and I ate. I was ridiculous. I ate way more than I can actually manage. And it came to the point where I felt drunk. I felt sick. I felt like I couldn't do nothing. And so that being said, I decided, okay, you know what? I've learned a valuable lesson. Okay, just because you now get this plethora of food, don't overdo it because I felt completely awful. And for most of the night, I couldn't even really do nothing. And I was thinking, I'm stocking up because I'm going to go on this long stretch. But I realized that is not the healthiest way to do things. But going back to the idea, it was a huge blessing to be able to go over to somebody's home who was willing to share with me some of their food. And it added a little diversity to help me keep going. But in other situations where I realized community helped, I was speaking with a friend at work. Her name is Emily. And Emily, I later found out she had access to these beehives, and she had built a little company called Unicorn Honey. And I had no idea of this. And she was telling me how she makes flavored or hot honeys. And I'm like, that's rather interesting. But when she heard the kind of thing that I was doing, she's like, you know what I'm going to do for you? I'm going to just bring you some honey. And I'm like, you don't really have to do that or whatnot. But she's like, no, I don't mind. I'll bless you. And I'm going to just tell me what kind of flavor you might be interested in. And I'm going to bring you some honey. And that's so you can add it to your the foods that you have. And I thought it was such a huge blessing. Now, unicorn honey, the honey was good. And if you're interested in tasting her hot honey, that's what I believe she calls it, is that the hot honey could be found. You can contact her at Unicorn Honey at Emily Kurt, Emilykert at gmail.com. Connect with her, and she might be able to provide you with some of her delicious honey. But it was one of those great blessings because it added a diversity to my very low variety of food. In another situation, for example, my sister is a teacher, and she was talking to some of her students about what I'm doing. And would you know, these students who don't know me from Adam chose to go and into their garden, they collected some carrots and some squash. And the carrots was a very beautiful thing because I was trying to grow carrots and nothing was growing. They didn't catch. But yet, here I had this beautiful meal, and this happened around the third week in, where my potatoes were running extremely low. Diversity was getting thinner and thinner and thinner. And so it was great to have this little blessing where I got to make myself some carrot, onion, and squash mixture that I would eat with my fish, but it was a fabulous blessing. And so another situation that I want to talk about that I had also gone through was, for example, I was out there fishing because all my fish was depleted now. And so it came to a point where I got to get out there and get some more. And I found this river that I was testing out, and I'm trying and I'm casting and casting, nothing's happening. No matter what, there's no bite. So then I go to another part of the river, and there's one gentleman there because the earlier part where I was, there was all these people there. And maybe that's why. Maybe that section was just worked out. So when I went to the other section, though, the beautiful thing was there was this older gentleman there, and him and I were talking, and I was just asking him about has he found any fish out here and whatnot. And he's like, I haven't really caught nothing so much, but he was telling me about certain parts we can try. And so I didn't want to interfere with where he was fishing, so I went to a different part of that river, and I started just casting and stuff, and nothing once again was coming, no matter how much. But then he began to tell me about, you know what, I made these adjustments to my rod, similar to like when I was at the other place. And so I made the adjustments and started casting as well. But here's the kicker. In having a conversation and building this small acquaintance with this man, all of a sudden I hear, friend, friend. And I look over and I'm like, yeah. He goes, I got something. And he comes over with this fish. And he looks at me and he goes, I normally catch and release, but I heard what you're doing. I was wondering if you would like this fish so you could have something to eat. And I was like, God be praised. God bless you, my friend. And it was such a happy moment for me because realizing how we can connect and help each other achieve our goals, and even just seeing the humanity of him not just choosing to think of himself and do his sport, but he actually thought of me. We were strangers who became acquaintances. And so when he handed me that fish, it was one of the greatest blessings I ever received. And it was something that really lifted my spirits on how I see us mankind dealing with one another. I gladly took the fish, and then God be praised, when I started casting, I myself started catching. I caught some perch. He gave me a smallmouth bass. I got a perch. And at the end of the day, I was able to have food for the week, which was a huge blessing. So I've realized in all of this, one of the things I've learned through Self Reliant September is you've got to remember there is a community. There is people out there who, if we network together, we can help whatever our self reliant goals, we can help achieve them. The scripture says, how can two walk together unless they agree? If people understand your vision and are with you, they can help you achieve your goals and your victories. So I realize that is something very important. Now, one of the last things I'm going to touch on in regards about that gardening and stuff like that was just a little thing that I learned about when it came to harvesting, because I began to understand how and where to harvest fish. Now, I don't know all these special fishing techniques, but I know certain techniques that work where I go. But as for the garden, one thing I learned was about when to collect. I learned don't wait too long. Don't always expect your thing to grow into the biggest of this or the best. Don't expect it to always look like what it came out of the grocery store looking like. Like, for example, my wife had some broccoli growing. And when we should have been picking it, we weren't. Next thing you know, they all blossomed into the florets blossomed into flowers, and now the broccoli is something totally different. Mind you, I don't know if we should. I ate it same way. Same thing with my cauliflower. I had a little cauliflower growing, and instead of picking him when he was a small little bun, I left him, and then it started continuing to grow, and it became something else. I ended up canning that jar. I'm actually going to eat it today, but where I'm going with this is I realize learn proper timing of when to pick. Another thing that I also recognized is learning the difference between the flowerings of each plant. I recognize some plants, you want the flowers. For example, with peppers and tomatoes, you realize those flowers are what's going to produce your vegetable. But when I recognize, for instance, my onions, they begin to flower, then I began to learn about this thing called bolting, in which a plant is so under stress, it produces a flower in hopes to reproduce. But the problem is flowers take a tremendous amount of energy from the plant. And if it starts bolting, your vegetable, like in my case, the onion, is not going to start growing. It's not going to put that much more energy into it. So I learned next time I ever see certain vegetables bolting, clip those flowers so I can keep pumping the energy into the food. But I also realized this also means I got to check how the environment that I've got my vegetable growing in. So switching gears just a little bit, I want to talk about what I physically went through. How my energy changed, my emotions, and the physical changes I went through with my body. Like when I began, it was slow. Life, it was rather interesting. My energy wasn't really there because I was feeling hungry for the first part. But after a while, it's like the body switched, and once it switched over, I had this vitality coming within me. My body began to learn how to function off of this lower calorie intake and the types of foods I was eating. And in the early stages, I found I was very erratic with my emotions. I would snap. I would be very defensive. I realized once again, or I was reminded of how connected our food is to our emotions. And when we take out certain foods that we even use to comfort ourselves, then our emotions are going to be intact because in a sense, you're going through your own form of withdrawal. And so I kind of didn't really have good control at home emotionally. And this helped me to really focus on these things. So then I began to start regrouping in my mind, looking at how I'm behaving. And then I began to adjust it. I began to have to find other things to occupy the time where that food would have done that. And my body, for instance, I began to have this life. I began to realize I was shedding weight as well. Now, I know some of it would have been water weight, but some of it just simply wasn't because I still had carbs in there to retain my water, which was through the potatoes. It's just a lower calorie intake. But my mind also became super alert. It was almost like I was constantly ready looking for where is there food. So this clarity came about by refining the food. And I think some of that clarity also came about from no longer eating so much processed food. I was just eating straight whole food. And in regards to my weight, I was rather pleased because when I started Self Reliant September, I started at 244.8 pounds. And by the end of September, I ended at 230 pounds, point 4, or 230.4 pounds. So I did lose a considerable amount ever since I've stopped September, and now we're into October. My weight has raised about to 233. And I think this is just because I've slightly increased the calories I'm taking in. But what I have opted to do, I am now eating way more fish. It's funny because I remember saying to myself, ooh, I want some fast food. And I might have already said this before, so forgive me. But coming off, instead of wanting burger or anything like that, it was funny because I was wondering, does this burger place sell fish? I realize fish has become something that I think about more consistently now. And funny enough, rather than buying fish, I'm kind of preferring to go out and fish my own fish where I know where it came from and eat it. I know the quality of the water where it's coming from, and so that it's become a little part of my life now. I realize I'll probably be moving my diet to more 80% pescatarian and then the 20% fowl and red meat. I do like game meat, so I like to eat my bison and deer and elk whenever I can and stuff. And so I like those kind of meats, the game meats, because I know they're pure. They're not being, the ones that I'm getting are not farm raised and stuff like that. So it's a lot more healthier intake, I believe. When you're eating red meat or even fowl for that matter, where you get it from is what can make the difference on how healthy of a meat you're actually consuming. But I know we always don't have access to that. So you do what you can do within your means. But the ultimate end was eating a lighter meat tend to make me feel a lot better. And being moderate with the heavier meats keeps me safer. Now, speaking about eating, going backwards, I guess back to food, I gotta admit there were certain times where I did slip. I didn't have the willpower or that ultimate fortitude to just stay so diligently at it, and I would slip and cheat. At certain points, I felt like I was a scavenger, and I really felt disgusted. So when that happened, it's like it happened, and then it wouldn't happen again because I'd feel so bad that I did it. But I remember by the second week, I was like breaking down. I'm like, no, I'm getting tired of all this. And so I remember my kids having their meals, and my kids weren't doing it with me. And I was just so hungry. I snuck in to eat some of their leftovers. I was going to go in the garbage. It was like I was eating scraps. It was like I felt like I'd become this scavenger, like a bird in the park. Speaking of birds in the park, I was on the trail one time walking. I became so hungry for diversity. I seen this type of bird, and when I looked it up, it was like a strange kind of it was a kosher bird, but I forget what kind of bird it was. I took a picture. It was strange, but I whipped out my slingshot thinking, I'm going to kill this bird because I am so hungry. I need change. But then good thing common sense came back to me saying, this is the park you're in. You're not even allowed to do that. So leave it. Let it live. And him and his little partner went off to go do their thing. But oh man, I so wanted to even pull out the crossbow and fire it. I just wanted to go back there and hunt. But I'm glad I was wise and I did the proper thing and I didn't do it. I remember one time when I was almost going to break, I was making certain food. I was stealing certain food from in the fridge I shouldn't eat. And my wife came down and she caught me. She caught me about to cheat, and I felt so bad about this. And she reminded me, she's like, God's not going to be upset if you break this, but just be true to yourself with what you're trying to do. Just stay focused and do what you're doing. And the thing is, when she talked to me, it made me realign myself. But and she helped me from about to fall, but she also helped me realize when you're committing to some, just commit, and you got to find ways to distract yourself, and you got to become accountable for the actions you're about to do. So that helped me. Like, I did have some slips here and there. I wasn't perfect, but ultimately I was 95, I dare I say 93 to 95% successful in staying with the program. One of the things this program did teach me, this little experience, is the benefits of self-denial and fasting. I began to incorporate intermittent fasting into my days because it was the only way to really, get through the days properly. I couldn't keep spreading out food and all that because I tended to find if I was spreading out the food, I was feeling more hungry. But if I ate my set meals within these time limits, I was a lot more satisfied. I found in the self denial of certain foods and stuff like that, and even activities, because I realized there were certain activities I couldn't do because they kept plugging me back to want to eat food. But I began to learn about, you gotta just fight the craves. You gotta find things to do to fight the craves. And the funniest thing is, when I began to fight the craves and deny certain habits that I normally was doing, that normally would bring me back to food, it began to change the way my mind was thinking of what my habits were and what I would do. So, for instance, I all of a sudden began to get this thing of desiring to be way more productive. Like, for example, I'm in the process of trying to write a book. Now I began to be like, instead of sitting here just watching YouTube videos or watching a movie or doing stuff like that, it became why don't I sit down and put some of this energy that I have into the book? Why don't I go for a walk? Why don't I try and practice some of the skills I'm learning? And this is one of the things I began to find is, it was almost like certain bad habits I had were beginning to get replaced with better habits, habits that would develop me more. So I realized there is a beauty in our own growth when we learn to control our mind and our body and our emotion through self-denial and fasting. So ultimately, coming back down, I'll tell you, like, seeing this thing to the end the best I could, it shifted the way I think. It shifted the way I think about food till this day. And yeah, I might have a lot more things to eat now and all that, but now what I've been doing is really watching how I eat and when I eat and trying to weed out the things that won't be helping me. Now, in November, I'll be going on a different spiritual journey, which is called the 21 Days of Progressive Fasting and Prayer, in which, once again, going back into the world of self denial and fasting, but just for now, clarity, focusing on how I can fortify my family and stuff like this. And the experience of September has helped prepare me for what I'm going to be doing in November. And so I encourage you, whenever we have adventures like these, join us, because you'd be surprised the way it changes how you look at the world. So, at the end of September 31st, I believe, October 1st, I remember I said to myself I was going to treat myself. And coming down to a close in this conversation, I said, I deserve it. I'm going to treat myself to some fast food. And I already told you, when I went to the fast food place, I was looking for fish, and funny enough, where I was, I didn't find something that I would have really considered to eat. So I ended up buying this burger, which I hadn't had red meat in a long time, or it felt like a long time. And I had fries, and I normally get water with my thing, with my meals. And I ate that food. And for the first 3 minutes, I was like, oh my gosh, I forgot how this food tastes. By 5 to 7 minutes later, I felt so sick. I realized my body just wasn't about it. I realized at that point that no, I wasn't supposed to be eating that anymore. It was done. And I from this point, I changed how I look at getting fast food, those kind of things. And I kind of will just make my own food. And I'm going to try and stick to not really eating so much of that processed food no more. It didn't really work with me. Having a lot of bread contact wasn't really working with me, I'm realizing. But simplifying the food I eat has brought a lot more clarity to my mind and a lot more energy to my body. And plus, it feels great losing more weight. And I'm going to keep on that mission. I've been actually working on trying to now figure out a new exercise regimen, one that I can actually do day by day. And I guess it all starts with that first step. So I'm starting very simple. A couple of push-ups, a couple of squats, going for a walk. I've got weights and stuff here, but I'm going to take this slow, day by day. And rather than jumping in, I'm going to build new habits, like the new habits I learned during Self Reliant September. I know this was a very long podcast today and longer than usual, but I'm happy. I'm really happy you guys came to join me to hear my experience. If you were out there and you were joining in on Self Reliant September, I'd love to hear about your experience. But friends, putting ourselves to these challenges helps define us and let us see what we're really made of. And everywhere where we fail, everywhere where we fall short, we at least get something we know we can improve at and grow and become better at. So I'm grateful for this year, 2021 Self-Reliant September, and I'm looking forward to next year's. I got a lot more things to learn and a lot more things to practice. Who knows how I'll intensify it? Maybe I'll add something else to the mix. But it was an awesome adventure, and I'm glad I could share this with you. Remember, I'm going to be posting a couple of videos. I'll probably compile them all together on YouTube to go along with this podcast. And it was a grateful adventure. Another reminder, remember, check us out at the Tinder Bundle Ministry YouTube playlist. Check us out on our podcast, and you can hear so many other things that we're doing. I talk about preparedness, and I also deal with devotionals for people. It was great having you join me, as I said today, and I hope you join us back again. I hope you focus on what can you improve at and grow at with your life. And so, friends, once again, I'm your host, The Wandering Avad. And today's little season here is, of course, brought to you by the Adama Project. And some of you might wonder, what's the Adama Project? Adama Project is an outreach program for the homeless people in the cities, in which we try to reestablish them and just reaffirm to them that we see them and help them get back on their feet, starting with a conversation. This, once again, is the Tinder Bundle. I am your host, The Wandering Avad. And before you go, remember, be fruitful, be blessed, and be safe. Godspeed, my friends. And I think now I'm going to go clean some fish and go make my lunch. God bless you all. Take care.